Welcome to CWJah Talk number 6. My name is Greg Stafford, and I started these videos, which include these CWJah Talk shows, day text videos, which are based on our early meetings during the week at 5 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and occasionally a pre-recorded great message to try to highlight some of the things from history and from the biblical books and from other histories written around or during or about the biblical times, because we're Christians as our religion, but we're not the kind of Christians who go around telling people what to do, and we have a whole bunch of tradition that we bring to our view of the biblical text. We just are trying to be good people. Christian witnesses of Jah try to focus on three things: Jah, the God whom we can identify throughout history, and whom we believe we can show scientifically exists eternally, because life can only come from existing life. There can be no break in that chain. And so we believe that shows life must be eternal, and the manifestations of life over the course of known history show that the life that exists is intelligent and that it reproduces according to its kind. And now we find ourselves doing the very things that we believe and that we read about Jah doing with life, creating it to govern various spheres of influence and to bring about certain conditions, to reproduce, to fill the earth. So we find ourselves doing similar things, not only on the earth, but even considering inhabiting other planets. So in any case, when we talk about our beliefs, they often get related to or associated with the beliefs of other religions that aren't quote-unquote Christian or Jewish, because the Christian religion really stems from the Jewish religion, the ancient Jewish religion, the religion established by Moses and promised through people like Abraham, who lived in the land of Ur, Mesopotamia, and before him, the God who communicated to the likes of Noah and his sons, and before him, to other persons like Adam and Enoch and Abel before he was killed. So we can trace our history as humans and our humans worship, our human worship, the humans who worship the God Jah, all the way back to the time in the Garden of Eden, which we have established was a real location that can be defined by the descriptions given in the book of Genesis, and through use of things like satellite imagery. Photos that show fossil rivers that once existed, but that we don't see the way they once flowed. Okay, so since this time, we're going to move past that time of Eden and Noah. If we go past the point of the flood, where, according to the histories, Noah landed in eastern Anatolia, which is in where we know today as Turkey, eastern Turkey. And then there was a migration of peoples down into the area of Mesopotamia, and in the southern area where cities like Babylon and Nineveh were established. The records indicate that people who established those cities included Nimrod, one who was known as a mighty one who opposed Jah. And so Nimrod is credited with establishing places like Babylon, places that we know from events like the Tower of Babel, where language was separated. Right? I did a great message in a show that covered the history of our language and how we really can only trace actual accepted human forms of language to the 4th century BCE at the latest. Okay? Not including glyphs and cave paintings. I'm talking about actual writing. So everything gets traced back to this area in Sumer, Mesopotamia, with some similar language and writing potentially in other continents like South America, because the land was different before the flood. But after the flood, it talks about how Nimrod established these cities in Mesopotamia and how Nimrod was essentially worshipped by people at that time. And so you get a lot of these stories and histories that stem from that time that then develop into cultures, from the Sumerians to the Assyrians, to the Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, Romans. So Saturn follows in this line. Saturnus is often associated with, if not identified with, the Greek god Kronos. And then beyond him to the Egyptian god Osiris, all of which relates back to Nimrod in some way, and perhaps even before him to his father Cush. But with Nimrod, you get a variety of different things. You get not only the mighty hunter, the Osirian figure, and others like Cronus and Saturn, who are associated with the worship of the sun. Because with Nimrod, you have a unique figure where he's also associated with a goddess known as Ishtar. She was also known as Semiramis. And so you have other deities at the time. These are described in the Bible. Ishtar is mentioned in the Bible, as are other deities like Tammuz. And so you have Ishtar, Nimrod, the mother and father goddess, Ishtar, or Semiramis in this case, marrying her own son and giving birth to the child Tammuz. And so people will often associate these things with Christianity in ways because we believe similarly that Jesus is God's son. And in traditions like the Roman Catholic religion, which is not just Christian documents from the first century or copies shortly thereafter, it has its own authority structure and traditions, like the veneration of Mary, the elevation of Mary as the Mother of God or the Mother of Jesus. And so in one sense, you can see why people associate these ancient trinities, so to speak, Ishtar, Nimrod, Tammuz, with trinities they see in religions, Christian religions like the Catholic Church, Mary, the Father, and the Son. And so what can happen very easily is when you have non-Catholic Christian groups like us, the Christian Witnesses of Jah, and when you look at the original first century documents, and I'm talking about the writings that we look to for direction and understanding of what Jesus taught and what his early followers did, they're not the same as the traditions that have been developed from them or from these other Babylonian or subsequent religions. All of which in some cases most often, again, refer back to Nimrod and to the time after the flood. And we do get some carryover from the ancient pre-flood world in various gods and heroes like the Titans and the giants. And to what extent those actually relate to sons of God who came down, we don't know, because they were obliterated. They were totally destroyed by the flood. The entire earth was changed. So much so that we may even have remnants in places like Egypt, the Sphinx, for example, that's surrounded by what is clearly massive water erosion, which doesn't fit with the knowledge that we have of Egypt as we know it today or historically. So we have all of this evidence which shows that there was a time when things were different and that people then repopulated those regions and then even went back to some of those regions that were potentially populated before the flood and then built around them. And you have stories like this also in things like the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Gilgamesh is identified as one of these giant beings, special beings, And it talks about how he also went about to the different places after the flood to try to restore them in some way, which is interesting because when you look at some of the places around the earth, like Pumapunku, or various places that have been thrown down and destroyed, they almost do seem like somebody tried to restore them. And whether or not that fits with the story of Gilgamesh, I don't have enough evidence to say. But these are some of the stories and the legends, associations that people make today. And so, get the focus there right. And so when we encounter people and talk about things like Christmas, when they have these things in their mind, these association of these deities all the way back to Nimrod and to even his father Cush or his mother and wife Semiramis, Ishtar, and their child Tammuz. And so they see things like in the cross of Christianity, the T of Tammuz. Even the Watchtower Society right? If you've been associated with them, you know they, even though representing themselves as Christian, will refer to the cross as the essentially representation of the T in Tammuz. But here's the issue. And here's where we're going to go from Saturn, Saturnalia to Christmas, and then from Saturn, Saturnus to Jesus. It's for us as Christians not about in any way maintaining or knowingly furthering these traditions that have nothing to do with Jesus and his birth and the things that we read about taking place, which we'll get to in a moment. I'm going to read a couple accounts from the biblical books so we can all see exactly what they did and how they did it and how it relates to what we do today. Now, I know some people will even say, and they do, their videos, and I'll link to some because I want everyone to have a good, well-rounded understanding, and then you choose, who will associate things in the New Testament like the bread and the wine, for example, with celebrations of other gods like Mithras or Bacchus. But when you read the actual account, it's very clear that Jesus is celebrating the Passover. The Passover is a celebration that the Jews have held for a long time, related to their exodus from Egypt. So when Jesus held the Passover with his first students before he died, he was celebrating the Passover. He was not celebrating Mithras or Bacchus or anything else. And then he gave it new meaning by associating the bread and the wine with his blood and his body to remember him by after he died, which we as Christians do today when we're with each other, so that we can all keep in mind the things that he went through, knowing that we may have to go through the same things ourselves. But if we love the truth and we worship Jah, we're prepared for those things. So we don't worship Saturn or Saturnus or any of the gods associated with him in these ways. Now, the festival of Saturnalia itself, according to Livy, a Roman historian who lived between the 1st century and 2nd century, or I should say the 1st century BC and the 1st century CE, he wrote about the official start of Saturnalia as in the 5th century, 495 to be exact. But he, in the translation I read, uses the word officially. It officially started. So more than likely, some people refer to a later 5th century CE writer, Macrobius, as, basis for saying that Saturnalia was celebrated longer ago than the 5th century, 495. And I don't know that that's really reliable. I mean, we're talking about Macrobius in the 5th century CE writing about at least 1,000 years previously. And certainly we have Livy, 500 years or so more earlier or closer to the time we're talking about, the start of Saturnalia. But even he, I think, just makes it official. So likely they were celebrating some unofficial form of religion towards Saturn and or his earlier associations that was then made official in the 5th century. And then this festival, though, it really is not very much like Christmas, other than what is reported to be gift giving and a time of merry making. What festival isn't merry, right? What festival, especially a Roman festival where they would freely drink, and in the case of the Saturnalia, they would role change. And so they would have, for example, a slave take on the role of the master and the master the role of the slave. And they would even let the slave get away with, certain degrees of insolence toward the master. Although I don't think a wise slave would have done that, right? I mean, if you really want your master to care for you after that one day, probably not a good idea to be insolent just because you can. Right? Just because you can isn't really a good reason. Might be part of a reason, or a reason. But that's not really the only good reason to do something. So how they got away with it, they know. But we know that was a part of it. That's not a part of Christmas, though. Christmas today does not have a role reversal component. And we don't exist in the type of environment where there are slaves and masters in that sense. If anything, we just get the day off, right? We don't become the boss of the boss. We just get a little time off. We get a little extra perk, benefit. because it is considered a festive time of year. Now, let me just stick with Saturnalia for a moment before I get back to us. So they had those kinds of things. It was a celebration that could last up to a week. Various emperors changed that. So you had some who would reduce it to 5 or 3 days, but it could last up to 7 days. And it was not held on December 25th. Livy himself, I'm going to read from you a passage. It says right here in book 2, and then section 21.2, Livy writes, "Finally, in the middle of December, there was a sacrifice at the temple of Saturn. And for a day and a night, the cry of the Saturnalia resounded through the city. And the people were ordered to make that day a festival and observe it as such forever." And he's talking about the start of the official celebration of the Saturnalia in 495. And so he talks a little bit more about the Saturnalia also when he's describing the Battle of Hannibal at Cannae in the 4th century. But the point I'm making here is that the time he's referring to is in the middle of December. And others started around December 17th and extended through December 24th. But I'm not aware that any actual ancient celebration of the Saturnalia, certainly before the 1st century, Jesus' birth, was ever on December 25th. So that's not consistent with Christmas. The role reversing part is not consistent with how we celebrate Christmas. And when it comes to Saturn or Saturnus, we've talked about how he's associated with these other deities, potentially Cronus, Osiris, all the way back to Nimrod, who was deified before he was killed. So, but you also have Saturn associated with this idea of agriculture, the winter solstice, and also therein the worship of the sun god at the time when the sun was considered to be reborn. And there you have as well some of these other associations, like with the Grim Reaper, with the hooded, the veiled person with the sickle. This all relates to Saturn and the ancient worship of Saturnus as part of the Saturnalia during the time of the winter solstice. But really, it was not about December 25th. Okay, now I'm not going to get into the other celebrations of other gods on the 25th of December or other days. I'll save that for another time. Remember, today's show is about Saturnalia and Christmas and whether that equals Saturn versus Jesus. Now, Saturn versus Jesus, what I mean by that, I'm not trying to create antagonism between Christians and those who may worship Saturn. I mean, we just don't believe in the same deity, or we don't follow or honor them in the same ways. But I'm trying to disassociate this idea that Christmas is a celebration of the Saturnalia. And that's why I worded it that way, Saturn v. Jesus. Because I don't believe there's any association with the celebration of Christmas today on December 25th and the celebration of the Saturnalia around the middle of December for up to, but not always, 7 days, during which time they would do other things that are not involved in Christmas at all, like role reverse. So that's the point of today's show, is to first of all, give a little background on what is the Saturnalia, who is Saturn, and what was the festival in celebration of him all about? What were some of the component features? When did it happen? And then compare that with Christmas. Okay, so, why am I not referring to the Bible in the terms of how we celebrate Christmas? Well, I'm going to do that in a second, but it doesn't really matter. And I'm going to also show why I say that according to the Bible. But let me just explain first so that when I read it, you'll know what I'm talking about, and I won't have to say it again. Christians do not celebrate Christmas today for any other reason than to give honor to Jesus. which we often show by giving and receiving. Just like Jesus told us, there would be more happiness in giving than in receiving. So that would involve each person being able to experience the act of giving both by being a part of that exchange. And I'm not saying that's necessarily the basis for the ancient tradition of giving it on Christmas Day, but there's nothing inconsistent with it. And in fact, it is entirely consistent with what I just quoted Jesus is saying. And so let me now quote just a couple texts from the Bible. Two that describe the events of Jesus' birth, and then two that talk about how Christians view this kind of thing. Now, the first two I'm going to read are the letters from the letters written by Paul, who was a Jew that was converted to Christianity and who wrote to the Romans, was certainly aware of the Saturnalia, right? Certainly knew of the god Saturn, Saturnus. He knew of the celebrations, the festivals, all of them. He lived in Rome. He wrote to the Romans. He wrote about the Romans and the Roman gods and others. So here's what Paul said. I'm going to read first from the New World Translation, and it's in part because, as we know, the Watchtower Society, they don't promote Christmas, and if you celebrate, in fact, they would consider you a non-Christian. We don't do that. We don't believe that celebrating or not celebrating Christmas in any way determines that. You know, unless you're openly using it to disrespect the Christian God, Jah, or Jesus, or really anybody, right? We're not here to disrespect anybody, even Saturnians. Right? I'm just here to establish who we are and what we do and what we don't do. And so it's no real secret that worshipers of Jah don't worship Saturnus or Ishtar, right? We have ancient records going back about this rival. But we have to coexist today to the extent that the spirits and the authorities put in place allow. And that is what is taking place. That's why we have a semblance of order and not total destruction. But remember what Jesus said, if Satan divides against himself, how can he stand? Right? A house divided against itself will fall. So they have to keep things standing. That's why the Bible talks about the spirits who govern these different nations and groups, but who also are helping promote these different religions and ideas in opposition to Jah. So we have all these things happening and being allowed in the earth. We have to do our part. And I highly recommend, as you're going to see in a moment, that we follow what the Bible says if we're going to try to be Christian, and don't make it harder, more difficult for anybody to praise Jah or to give honor to his son. And if they choose to use Christmas to do that, I think, even if you don't agree with me right this moment, after you read these texts with me, you might see that that is the best way to be. If you don't celebrate it yourself and others choose to honor Jesus in that way, that is what they're allowed to do, and you should not interfere. You should, in fact, concentrate on yourself and help others as much as you can. But let me quote the texts, and I'm going to let them speak for themselves. Now, if you have a question, feel free to comment in the box. We will take questions for as long as you have them. We're about at 30 minutes. I try to keep the show about an hour, so we're doing pretty good on time. And I think I've set it up in terms of the historical comparison with the Saturnalia and Saturn and Christmas and Jesus. And so remember, I'm not dealing with other celebrations or other deities at this time. I'm just dealing with Saturn and those associated with him prior to the Roman introduction of Saturn and the worship of him in the Saturnalia. And so we've talked a little bit also about some of the claims that some make in terms of various other Christian traditions like the bread and the wine, supposedly related to festivities and celebrations related to Mithras or Bacchus, and how that's not the case, that those relate to actual biblical beliefs and traditions like the Passover, that Jesus simply I don't want to say restated, but he celebrated with new meaning. That's what I think is the right way to say it, because that's what he says he was doing. He was celebrating the Passover. That's why they got the room together. It had nothing to do with Mithras or Bacchus or anything else except that Passover celebration. And then his death and resurrection, his blood and his body. Okay, so moving past that though and back to Christmas and these festivals and celebrations. But this ties in because, right, I mean, even the blood and the wine is a celebration, a festival. And as you're going to see in some of the texts I read, they talk about things you eat or don't eat. So again, back to the rules again, and the things that as Christians we either should choose on our own to do, or we should try to help others with, in terms of being proactive and not allowing each person to give an account before Jah and Jesus. It should be pretty serious and almost, life-threatening if you're going to get that involved in someone's life just to help them deal with something they have authority to choose whether to celebrate or whether to eat or not. Let me quote these texts and you'll see why I'm talking that way. All right, so in Colossians chapter 2, just 2 verses, verse 16 and 17, it says this. Tell me what you think of this. Let no man judge you in eating or drinking, or in respect of a festival, or of an observance of the new moon, or of a Sabbath. For those things are a shadow of the things to come. But the reality belongs to the Christ. So he's openly stating right here, and this is in the context of, again, all these different religions and groups. You had Romans, Greeks, Jews, none of whom were really promoting Jah worship in association with Jesus. Maybe some of the Jews still carried on at this time a worship of Jah in association with the temple to the time it existed in 70 AD. But they were not really doing it according to the law of Moses. Still, they had to deal with those who celebrate festivals according to the law of Moses and others who celebrate festivals in accordance with their own religions. So he says not to let anyone judge you with respect to those things, or whether you drink or eat at those festivals, right? If you go to a festival, to a new moon or a Sabbath, and you're a Christian, but you don't celebrate those things, and you know that they're a part of the law that Jesus died to fulfill, why would he say those things? Because he's saying them knowing that that's not what we're supposed to get bothered about. We're not supposed to allow ourselves to be distracted by a shadow. We're supposed to be distracted by the reality of the Christ. The things that are just a shadow of what he came to fulfill have in large part become the reality, right? I mean, certainly for groups like the Watchtower, I guarantee you it'll be a reality for you if you start celebrating Christmas and go to their meetings and try to teach that as a good thing. You'll find reality really fast because to them that is a real big thing. It's not a shadow at all. Let me move to Romans now. Again, we talked about how Saturnalia is the Roman worship of Saturn, or Saturnus, and potentially related back to the Greek god Kronos, and also the Egyptian Osiris, and even the Babylonian Nimrod. But in the letter to the Romans, this is what Paul says. He's writing to people who clearly are right in the middle, if not, in fact, practicing many of the things that as Romans were common to do and were difficult to avoid doing unless they obviously openly involved some level of blasphemy or disrespect towards Jah. So, and for example, you can see this even in pre-Christians, right? You had people like Joseph and others. He was elevated to a governor in the Egyptian Empire. You don't think he showed honor and respect to the Egyptian culture and gods without openly worshiping them, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were called to do to the tower of the king of Babylon? So there are examples of this variation in acceptance or honor or acknowledgement, but not worship, of gods other than Jah. Okay, so now keep that in mind, because we're in the first century. Paul's writing to Romans, and here's what he says. He's a Jew converted to Christianity, and he's writing to Romans who are accepting Christianity. He says, I'm reading from my own translation now, verses 1 through 14, the whole thing, because every single verse will speak to you where it concerns these things. I'm confident in that. It says, but you must accept the one who is weak in the faith, not for the purpose of arguments over opinions. Now, on the one hand, he who believes eats everything, but the one who is weak in the faith eats food from plants. The one eating everything must not think less of the one who does not eat to the same extent. And he who does not eat must not think he is better than the one who is eating, for God accepts him. Who of you judges another person's servant? Before his own Lord he stands or falls. But he will be made to stand, because the Lord is able to make him stand. For example, I'm in verse 5. One person, this is where it directly relates to the Christmas Saturnalia, and should Christians do anything on that day. Verse 5. Romans 14. For example, one person judges one day as worth more than any other day. But another person judges every day the same. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who is concerned about a particular day is to express his thoughts to the Lord. The one who eats is to eat for the Lord, since he gives thanks to God. The one who does not eat for the Lord is not to eat, but he is to give thanks to God. For not one of us lives for him or herself, and not one of us dies for him or herself. If we live for the Lord, and if we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or we die, we belong to the Lord, not to each other in that way. It is for this very reason Christ died and then came back to life, in order that he might have authority over the dead and the living. Let me stop there real quickly. Who has authority over the dead and the living? You? Me? Anybody that you can name except the one we're talking about, Jesus, if you believe in him? So why are we making these decisions when we don't have the authority over the dead or the living? Let's get back to it here. For it is written, I live, says Lord Jehovah, to me every knee will bow, to me every tongue will openly confess. Therefore, this is Paul again, verse 12, each one of us will give an accounting for himself or for herself, for you. You answer for you, I answer for me. But we try to help everybody. Let's finish it off. Verse 13 and 14. So we should no longer be judging each other. Rather, we should judge this instead: the choice of not putting before your brother or sister a cause for stumbling or a reason for trouble. Now, you talk about the watch, they'll disfellowship you if you celebrate Christmas over it. If you put more value in one day as above another, or you view one day as different than another, you're going to get trouble. Let's just put it mildly, okay? And I'm not trying to pick on the Watchtower. They're one of the more well-known groups who do not celebrate Christmas. So it's easy to use them as an example of what can happen if you do or do not follow what a group says about a certain day. And since we're talking about Christmas, they're a group that fits in with that discussion pretty well. But does that fit in with what we're reading? Are we supposed to use a day? Any day, it says. Everything we just read. Are we supposed to use any of that to cause trouble? I mean, it almost seems so obvious that asking the question, I feel kind of stupid. But I know it's not for no reason, so I'll do it. Let's read the last verse. We have learned and we have been convinced by the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean on its own, other than by the one who considers it to be unclean. In other words, I know. To that one it is unclean. That's what he says. Nothing is unclean on its own. How does your conscience feel? How do you feel after you do something? Okay, that's how you should act. If someone else's conscience allows them to eat something or to go to a festival, even that may be based on the worship of some other god, a new moon, a Sabbath, I'm not trying to sanction anything. My point is, that's for them to decide. As long as they're willing to continue to praise Jah and promote Jesus without hypocrisy openly in ways that, would obviously be something no one could live with, right? If you're hurting someone else openly and then proclaiming Jesus as the one we should have faith in, there's certain things that just don't mix. But the celebration of days is not one of them. If it was, they wouldn't be writing like this to the Romans, right? We wouldn't have Paul, of all people, I say of all people because he was so active in this time and wrote about so many things, and he traveled all over the place. He would have made it clear, look, there's things here you guys got to not do. Don't do this, don't do that. It would have been very simple for them to do. That's exactly what they don't do. In fact, they begrudgingly give, I think, prohibitions in the book of Acts, where they say we've added, favored adding no further burden to you than to avoid these things. And he does talk about avoiding food sacrificed to idols. But remember, Paul then goes on to talk about that. There's nothing wrong with avoiding food that is sacrificed to an idol. But Paul goes on to explain that, not even that is something that each person gets to decide. If you're eating the food that someone else prepared or gave to you in honor of another god, and you eat that food to Jah, not to the god, according to what we just read, they will accept you. Jah will accept you. Jesus will accept you because you're doing it for them. You're not doing it for these other things. That's exactly what ties in with Christmas, because it doesn't matter if some of the celebrations or days or, events, festivities are also a part of other religious cultures, non-Christian religious cultures. If you're doing it to Jah, to God, to the Lord, you're not doing it for the reasons that others either are or were doing it for those other gods. That is the biblical teaching. That is our teaching. That's why we don't get involved in anybody's life when it comes to choosing whether to celebrate Christmas or anything else, unless you are openly opposing Jah in ways that, again, like we talked about, doesn't make sense or fit, like hurting or promoting killing somebody in a way that isn't self-defense, and then also talking about Jesus being the one who can give you life through forgiveness. So there are certain things that obviously conflict, but the Bible does not present festivities, celebrations, or eating or drinking as any of them. There are things that may be a concern. Maybe there are issues. It's not saying you have to celebrate these things, but we do not, as Christians, have a basis for running around telling other Christians they shouldn't celebrate this because it's similar to the celebration of this God. Certainly, I would argue, and the basis of this broadcast today is that Christmas is in no way really a promotion of Saturnalia or the worship of Saturn. There are numerous differences, even if there is merrymaking and some joy. I mean, what festival doesn't have that, right? And there may have been gifts exchanged, but again, it ties in with our view as it's better to give than to receive. So I don't know any Christian who believes that act involves the exchange of gifts that took place during the Saturnalia. So let me read to close this up before any questions, and then we've got about 15 minutes left. I'm going to read the last two accounts from the Bible, and they're about Jesus' birth. Okay, so if you want to know what is actually said in the Bible about the time Jesus was born and some of the things that are said, and how you're going to hear when I read this, they tie in with many things that you hear or that are said today regarding Christmas. And even non-Christians are described as coming to give honor to Jesus. Magic users, people from the East who believed in astrology, which is real, by the way. It's not something that you can't use. We're just told not to use it because we should have faith in Jah. And then you become more involved in astrology and trying to read these things versus allowing Jah to guide you. He's the one who put those things in motion. But various cultures and others use the stars and astrology to determine various times and seasons. You can also use the priestly divisions in the biblical records to show, because the Bible, it names the division serving at the time when Jesus was born, or when John was born, or maybe both. we'll go through the account another time. It wasn't something I intended to bring into this, but two things I'm going to discuss further later are the timing of Christmas in terms of the divisions, the priestly divisions, and how you can use those divisions to show not only the rough period of time, but also the season, and how it shows again that the timing of the birth of the Messiah was predicted long in advance. And in fact, you're going to see that the magic users and others, or the account that talks about them, quotes the book of Micah chapter 5. Remember, I showed that in the Dead Sea Scrolls in my Great Message video about Jesus and his preexistence, and how he was foretold in Micah, in text dated before his birth, to be one whose origins were from long ago, but who would come from Bethlehem. Okay, let me read these two accounts. They're very brief, but you'll like them because we're at the Christmas time, right? These are the Christmas accounts from the Bible, more or less. And notice the detail that they give. All right. I'm starting in Luke chapter 2, verse 1. I'm going to read verses 1 through 20. It says, "Now in those days a decree went forth from Caesar Augustus for all the inhabited earth to be registered. This first registration took place when Quirinius was governor of Syria." Notice how the Bible gives time, place, location. "And all people went traveling to be registered, each one to his own city. Of course, Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth into Judea, to David's city, which is called Bethlehem, because of his being a member of the house and family of David, to get registered with Mary, who had been given him in marriage as promised, at present heavy with child. While they were there, the days came to the full for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her son, the firstborn, and she bound him with cloth bands and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the lodging room. There was also in that same country shepherds living outdoors and keeping watches in the nights over their flocks." And that text right there is one of the reasons why it's believed that Jesus was actually born probably around October. And the priestly divisions in the Bible that also predict the coming of the Messiah would also be consistent with the birth of Jesus around that time. But I'll talk about that, and I'm also going to talk about the star that's referred to in these accounts that the Magi follow. I'll talk about that and the priestly divisions in another show. Let's get back to the account, though. Luke chapter 2, verse 9. It says, "And suddenly Jehovah's angel stood by them, and Jehovah's glory gleamed around them, and they became very fearful. But the angel said to them, 'Have no fear, for look, I am declaring to you good news of a great joy that all the people will have, because there was born to you today a Savior who is called Christ the Lord in David's city. And this is a sign for you. You will find an infant bound in cloth bands and lying in a manger.' And suddenly there came to be with the angel a multitude of the heavenly army, praising God and saying, 'Glory in the heights above to God, and upon earth peace among men of good will.' So when the angels had departed from them into heaven, the shepherds began saying to one another, 'Let us by all means go clear to Bethlehem, and see this thing that has taken place, which Jehovah has made known to us.' And they went with haste and found Mary as well as Joseph, and the infant lying in the manger. And when they saw it, they made known the saying that had been spoken to them concerning this young child. All that had heard marveled over the things told by them from the shepherds. But Mary began to preserve all these sayings, drawing conclusions in her heart. Then the shepherds went back, glorifying and praising God for all the things they heard and saw, just as they had been told." Okay, so that's Luke's account. Let me get right to Matthew now. We're going to read Matthew 1:18 through 2:6. And here's what it says about the birth of Jesus. "During the time his mother Mary was promised in marriage to Joseph, she was found to be pregnant with Holy Spirit before they were united. However, Joseph, her husband, because he was righteous and did not want to make her a public spectacle, intended to divorce her secretly. But after he had thought these things over, Jehovah's angel, or Jahoah's angel, appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary your wife home, for that which has been begotten in her is by Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you must call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this actually came about for that to be fulfilled which was spoken by Jahoah through his prophet, saying, Look, he's quoting Isaiah here, one of the best texts we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls, almost 2 complete copies, written 50 or 100 years or more before Jesus was born. Look, this is what quoting Isaiah. The virgin will become pregnant and will give birth to a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel, which means, when translated, with us is God. Because as we know, the Father works through Jesus, as he told everybody in John 14. You see me, you've seen the Father. Then Joseph woke up, verse 24, chapter 1. Joseph woke up from his sleep and did as the angel of Jahoah had directed him, and he took his wife home. But he had no intercourse with her until she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. After Jesus had been born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, look, astrologers, or magi, from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is the one born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east, and we have come to do him obeisance or honor, or even kingly worship, royal worship. Not the worship that belongs to Jah's God, but to those who would stand on the throne in his place, appointed by him, kings, as it says here, the King of the Jews. Chapter 2, Matthew, verse 3, we're almost done. At hearing this, Herod was agitated, and all Jerusalem along with him. And on gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he began to ask them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is how it is written through the prophet. And they quote Micah. Remember the text I showed you that we have copies of, dating earlier than the time these events took place in the first century with Jesus. And they quote Micah chapter 5. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the most insignificant city among the governors of Judah. For out of you will come forth a governing one who will shepherd my people Israel. And in Micah it goes on to talk about how his origins are from ancient times. He's speaking about the Son of God. Okay, so those are the accounts of Christmas in the Bible. You notice it talked about the shepherds. It talked about Mary and Joseph in the manger, the baby in the manger. It talked about the Magi. We didn't read the entire account about the Magi, but it goes on to talk about how they give him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. So everything we read in the Bible about the time when Jesus was born is positive. It speaks of goodwill to all men, because it's the time when the one we look to for salvation has been born. The one who was promised a long time ago in the Garden of Eden, no less, according to the records we possess, which talk about a seed. It would bring an end to the things that have gone wrong since that time. But, really, when we have Christmas celebrated today, what do you think of more? The things we talked about with Saturn, right? Role changing, middle of December, and his association with gods like Kronos, Osiris, Nimrod. True, there are exchanges of gifts during Christmas time, but again, the account in Matthew talks about it, goes on to talk about the gifts that were given in honor of Jesus, not of Saturn. And certainly the astrologers may have had many gods or deities they accepted and worshipped. And there's actual archaeological evidence I'm going to show in future broadcasts about these Magi. And again, I'll talk about the star too, and the priestly divisions that are described in the Bible. All of this is very important, but I can only fit so much in each show. We're about 5 minutes away from an hour. And so let me look at a few questions. But again, today, I don't know of any Christian, and certainly not me, or even others who may not like be really devoted Christians, but they kind of like accept it and they're okay with it being associated with Christianity in that way. I don't know of anybody who thinks about Saturn or the Grim Reaper. Some may, and that's okay. People can do what they want. That's not what we're about, controlling others. What we're about is promoting the worship of Jah, honoring Jesus, and treating others the way we want to be treated. And so the records we have tell us that we're not to judge anybody over how to celebrate a festival, a day, a new moon, a Sabbath. We are to allow that person to stand before their owner, their Lord, Jesus or Jah, both. We help where we can, but we don't own anybody. And we do not have the kind of authority that allows us to determine for others the things they can eat or not eat, or the days they can celebrate or not celebrate. Now, to the extent that we get involved ourselves, again, that's up to us. The same authority and empowerment we give to others to decide whether to celebrate Christmas in honor of Jesus or not, or in honor of Saturn or not. But again, if they're wanting to worship Saturn, they should probably move that to the middle of December, right? And not go past the 24th, if at all, because that wouldn't be worshiping Saturn, according to the ancient Saturnalia, which we can document. So it's important that we compare these things. Like I said, I just wanted today to highlight the connection or lack of connection between the Saturnalia and Christmas, Saturn and Jesus. But you'll encounter all kinds of views, as I mentioned before, even those that claim that the bread and the wine that we use as Christians to celebrate Jesus' death or to promote the time when he'll return. You could find parallels of similar things in religions devoted to Mithras and others, but that's not our goal. That's not who we worship. That's not what we're promoting. And so that's why we have to allow each person to decide what they're doing or what they're promoting, who they're promoting, by what they're doing. And if not at all, and they're just being festive, even to their own gods, we are given authority to make those decisions whether to celebrate or not. Because Jah is the one who allows all these gods, whether they oppose him or not. The only reason they're allowed to do so is because of Jah. So who are we to get in the way when he says, this is okay for now, this is what is permitted, this is their authority, and this is what you should do if you feel that way. You have authority. Just don't go choosing for other people what to do, because I'm the one they have to answer to. You know, I'm speaking as if I were Jah. And I think if you do that, you'll not only be happier, you'll be able to potentially celebrate these things in ways that won't burden you maybe the way they used to, or you'll at least allow others to use it as a time to promote Jesus, right? They're already thinking about him to some extent, or at least it's easier to talk about Jesus during a time that's supposed to be related to a celebration of his birth, whether it is or not, right? It's another day when people are more likely to be thinking about something associated with Jesus than not. And so there's no reason not to use it to promote goodness and love and show honor and respect to Jah and Jesus, and even to these other gods if others choose to worship them. It's not our place to go jumping around and interfering with these other practices, okay? Do it or don't. Otherwise, focus on Jah and the other two things. Now, there's a question, if someone says Merry Christmas to you, how should you answer? And as you know, we don't tell people what to do. I do have my opinions, so I will give those. But I always want to preface opinion questions, right? I mean, it wouldn't be any fun if I never gave my opinion or we never talked about opinions. That's okay. Remember what it said in the other account. We were talking earlier in Colossians. It said, maybe it was Romans. It was talking about how arguing over opinions. And it's okay to give opinions and talk about them. But, we don't want to get distracted by opinions about things when we should be talking about the reality. The things we know and can prove, and there aren't really a speculation so much. So when someone says Merry Christmas to you, well, I can only tell you what I would do, and I do not put myself out as the standard, because again, I only hold people to the standard of three things. Everything else is up to you, right? You might not choose the foods I eat. You might not celebrate certain things I celebrate. That's okay. That does not interfere with our worship of Jah, Jesus, or treating others the way we want to be treated. Those are the only things that matter. And to the extent that I would have to sacrifice my preferences to win someone, like Paul says, we don't want to stumble other people, then I would do it. Or it's up to me to do, right? It's up to me to decide to what extent I'm going to do something or not do something because of how it affects other people. That's for me to say. And then that's for you to say. But when we come together like this, unless we're having a subject talk, about Christmas or something, we do it because we want to have a better appreciation and how to deal with things. Or like Betsy's saying, what do we say when people say Merry Christmas? Well, it may seem like the long way to get to the answer, but again, that's because I don't think our opinions are the most important, but that our individual choices are what matter the most, at least to Jah. I don't see a problem. If someone is saying Merry Christmas to you, let's answer it this way. What do you think the intent of them saying that to you is? Or even if someone says to you, if you're a Christian, and someone says to you, Happy Hanukkah. You don't celebrate Hanukkah, I don't think. Would you say, same to you? Happy Hanukkah, back to you, in return? Or would you change it and say, Merry Christmas? They're saying one thing, you say another. I think I would say Happy Hanukkah. Or same to you. Because I believe, just in a hypothetical, but that could happen, I would more likely get them to connect with me in the way I would need to talk about them something more important by acknowledging their good wish, their goodwill, which is what they mean usually by Happy Hanukkah or Merry Christmas. If I accept that and even give it back in the way that they meant it, if I feel it's in goodwill, which most often it is, I believe that will allow me a better opportunity to deal with something more important. And I can tell you what that is. 3 things. Jah, Jesus, and how to treat others the way I want to be treated. I'd rather be able to get to those 3 things than get hung up on whether or not I should say Happy Hanukkah or Merry Christmas or something else. In my view, and again, this is not we don't have rules. We don't have standards other than we worship Jah. Are you going to worship Jah? You're going to help me promote Jah? Great. We worship Jah. We're going to go promote Jah. We're going to defend Jah. Same with Jesus. Same with how we treat others the same way. That's it. Everything else is a personal choice. Every day you choose to celebrate is your choice. Is it a good thing? Will it make you a better person? Will it help other people? Can you show honor to Jah and Jesus doing it? That's really the question, right? Can you celebrate Christmas according to the accounts we read in the Bible having to do with Jesus' birth, and knowing what we're to do and not do when it comes to the celebration of days or what we're to eat or not eat, what we read about in Romans and Colossians? With all that in mind, can you honor Jesus and Jah by celebrating Christmas? I can. Easily. Many different ways. And I believe and I have helped others do the same things, or just without even mentioning them, if it's not I don't always try to force it. I never try to force it. It either fits a subject or not, because it can come out awkwardly if it's not, the timing isn't right for some of these subjects. But giving, showing love. You see, you don't need timing for things like that because they're not associated with a prejudiced view that some may have about things like Jesus or Jah. But if you can use Christmas, even to a non-Christian, and show them love, or show them how we try to treat people fairly as Christians. We make mistakes, but what we're trying to do in imitation of Jesus. That's more likely to get them to take a closer look at your religion and the people you're following, like Jesus, than just bringing up Jesus and saying it's all about Jesus and the reason for the season. Those things may, that's not the way to really connect with someone on a truly spiritual and I think personal level. I think, if anything, that creates more contention or makes light of the holiday. Just be what you say it should be, and don't try to make it a slogan. Right? I don't think that. I think if you just be the way that you think you should be in honor of Jesus on any day of the year, and especially a day of the year that's set up to honor Jesus, not Saturn, then you should have no problem. Right? If you're a Christian, that should be easy for you to see ways you can highlight Jesus and the things he stands for during a time when others are together, when they're giving and receiving, they're showing love. Tell me a better time you're going to have to exchange greetings with someone and connect with them personally, and even more so in a way where that feeling is present more so than many times of the year. I don't think you're going to get much of a better opportunity than around Christmas time. And that's not to say that Christmas is directly defined in the Bible. December 25th, as I read in the accounts, the shepherds were in the fields watching over their flocks at nights. The divisions, the priestly divisions in the Bible are also consistent with that, showing that Jesus was likely born around October. But it doesn't matter. Does it really matter? So, if later Christians or even Romanized Christians, and remember, Christianity is not a Roman religion, which is why we're arguing or discussing the issue of Saturn versus Jesus, or the Saturnalia versus Christmas, right? The Romans at this time, and up until the 2nd or 3rd century, and maybe even beyond to in various extents at different points, even though Christianity became more of a state religion at that time, but really, they were worshiping Saturn for several hundred years from the time of Jesus. So people often think of Rome as Christians in Rome, and because of the Catholic Church and what happened several hundred years later. But the worship of Saturn and the worship of Jah or Jesus were nowhere near the same thing then, and they're not the same thing now. So I wanted to have a show and talk about it, and give people an opportunity to at least consider these things, both from the records that we have, like Livy and others, who talk about when the Saturnalia took place in the middle of December and the things that were associated with it, versus the time when people have chosen to celebrate Christmas. Even December 25th doesn't fall within what we know to be the time when the festival of the Saturnalia was celebrated. So I see really no connection whatsoever, even though there may have developed a connection, especially as various quote-unquote Christian groups developed different traditions and then took on various ancient beliefs and practices, which may in fact get close to, if not in fact involve, worship of Saturn or the deities that precede him, like Osiris, and all the way back to Nimrod and to the son of Nimrod and Ishtar, or Semiramis, Tammuz. So those things are there, and you can historically trace them as it pertains to certain traditions that aren't related to the biblical narratives, but that are related to traditions that certain Christian groups, like some Catholics and others, have taken on, that are then associated with these other ancient practices and beliefs. So sounds like we have agreement there in terms of what we should say to people. Someone says Merry Christmas to you. Again, that's up to you. Every person must make their choices in those ways, but we don't judge you one way or the other. We're here to promote Jah, promote Jesus, and treat others the way we want to be treated. That includes making mistakes, seeking forgiveness from them and from others, and also being quick to give it ourselves so that we're not hypocritical. And where that crosses over into the area of people choosing what to eat, what to celebrate, how to celebrate, we're just not going to do it. We're not going to step into that role for any person but ourselves, individually, because that's how we're all going to be judged individually anyway. And so if we keep that in mind and prepare ourselves more for that eventuality versus being the one who tells others what to do as if they're answering to us, I think we'll be less likely to overstep our authority. Certainly where it concerns Christmas and other holidays, I think we can make use of them versus not making use of them at all, or worse, making it hard for other people to effectively use them to promote Jesus and his birth and everything surrounding it. There are a number of things in the accounts of Jesus' birth in the Bible that are carried on in Christian traditions today. And So whether you choose to do them or not is again up to you. But I wanted to introduce this series of discussions on Christmas and some of the beliefs and practices of ancient religions, in this case, the worship of Saturn and the celebration of the Saturnalia, so that as we go forward into this year's Christmas, we'll all at least have a little bit better understanding of some of the things associated with it, rightly or wrongly, and then we'll be in a position, hopefully a better position at least, to decide whether or not we want to be involved.